we are here tonight to talk about the story of the Twitter files, a story that involves one of the most influential social media companies in the world, a company with the power to shape elections, to foment revolutions, and more, and the way in which that platform put its thumb on the scale of the public conversation over the past decade. The story begins right where Nellie and I are sitting right now. It begins at dinner time in LA on December 2nd, when I received a text, a signal message from Elon Musk asking if I was interested in looking at Twitter's archives. And 2.5 hours later, we were on a flight to San Francisco with our baby. In the days that followed, two of us, together with the journalist Matt Taibbi, the journalist Abigail Schreier, Leighton Woodhouse, Lee Fang, and the two reporters that are joining us here tonight, Michael Schellenberger and David Zweig, camped out in a windowless, fluorescent, very smelly conference room at Twitter headquarters, where we began looking through the company's vast archive of internal communications. And I think what we found is the story of the way that a handful of partisans at a private company worked in tandem with the government to suppress legitimate debates and to gaslight the public about it. Now, whether or not that's the story that's been told in the press is part of the conversation I want to have tonight. Anyway, with no further ado, I want to introduce to you two of the reporters that did so much of the incredible work over the weeks that we were at Twitter, one of whom is Michael Schellenberger, the author of San Francisco and Apocalypse Never, who edits the incredible Substack Public alongside Leighton Woodhouse. Michael, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Bari.
And then we have the wonderful David Zweig, a reporter who has spent the past 3 years writing about COVID, and his forthcoming book is called An Abundance of Caution. David, thanks for joining us.
For having me.
And last but not least, we have Nellie Bowles, staff writer at the Free Press, whose TGIF column is the jewel in our crown. And yes, she paid me to say that. Nellie, thanks for making the time.
It's a pleasure to be in my home.
So, Michael, David, Nellie, the mainstream media sort of all but ignored the Twitter files, right? Half of the country is not really aware that this story exists. And those who did read about it were sort of told that it was a big, fat nothing burger. So I wanted to start there. What are the Twitter files for people who are busy, who actually have lives that don't live on the internet? What is the story of the Twitter files? What is the big headline that you take away from the dozens, I think, of threads that have happened until now? Michael, maybe let's start with you.
Sure. So this is a really extraordinary and historic situation where you have the new owner of a major social media company. I think it's fair to say it's the most important social media platform for the news media industry and for people looking for hard news. And he opened up his files. It's emails, it's internal messaging called Slack, it's some attachments, even some Google Docs. And we just had our run of it. You know, I wanted to clarify one thing because there's been a lot of misinformation about here. You, Bari, asked me to come in. Elon Musk did not choose me in particular. I know that he reached out to you and Taibbi, but I went in, and when I first met him, he said he didn't know who I was. But I'm one of the few, I think maybe the only one of us that's published significant criticisms of Elon Musk in the past. So the claims that have been made about us are mostly false, that we were all selected by Elon or that we were chosen because we're somehow pushovers. That's definitely not the case. Neither one of those is not true, at least in mine. And we had very extraordinary access, and we did a series of pieces that we worked on individually, but also as a collective, that basically showed that much of people's fears were true, that there was a hegemonic, woke, politically left culture within Twitter that was censoring disfavored voices, not just people on the right, but also people like Marshall Kildor from Harvard, who had important opinions to share about COVID. There was, we saw really inappropriate levels and perhaps illegal levels of FBI and other intelligence community interference and demands being made on Twitter. We've also seen that on Facebook. We saw a decision to both deplatform the president of the United States and a decision to censor the New York Post in its coverage on October 14th for the first time of Hunter Biden's laptop. Decisions that were made countermanding the evaluation from the entire Twitter safety and trust team, including the head of safety and trust, which said that the tweets in question, first from Donald Trump and then from the New York Post, did not violate Twitter's terms of service. And so we were able to document the ways in which Twitter was, one could say, breaking its own rules or rewriting its own rules in order to comply with an overwhelming societal pressure to first deplatform and then censor the laptop. And one final thing I'll add, which is this story is still ongoing. The Twitter files were mentioned by a member of Congress on the floor yesterday. I retweeted it. Elon replied to it. This is an active investigation into the potential politicization of the FBI. And what we saw was, at a minimum, deeply inappropriate, a grotesque inflation of the threat of so-called Russian misinformation, absolute abuse of power, both by intelligence agencies, members of Congress, by special interest groups, the White House, to try to get these social media platforms to censor disfavored opinions that were totally legitimate and should never have been disfavored. And we may have also seen a concentrated effort. I don't have the proof of it, but we may have also seen a coordinated effort by existing intelligence agency staffs and former intelligence agency staffs to try to basically pre-bunk the Hunter Biden laptop, to basically discredit it before it was released. And if that was indeed what was going on, it's a very significant potential crime and undermining of the democratic process.
So what I'm hearing is kind of two headlines. The first being that Twitter claimed to be the public square. You claimed to be a sort of digital agora, but actually, it was saying that in public and privately blacklisting certain ideas, people, debates, suppressing others, and therefore shaping the public conversation. And the second is that Twitter was working surreptitiously with various government agencies, maybe especially the FBI, in ways that we're just starting to understand. Many people who are not us and have never logged on to Twitter and think to themselves, why should this story matter to me? Nell, why should people care about this story?
Because Twitter matters, because social media companies matter, because these are the veins for our public conversation. Like the rhetoric of the digital town square might sound cheesy, but it's true. And if they effectively pretend to be nonpartisan and unbiased, but actually they are extraordinarily partisan, extraordinarily biased, and actually they are acting really specifically to get specific people elected, then we should know that. That's really important. And more broadly, Twitter matters a lot because it is the assignment editor for reporters and editors at every prestige publication in America. Twitter is what reporters have open on their computers all day long. And so it influences every layer of American discourse. That would be why I care.
David, the story that you pursued, and I want to get to the FBI and the Hunter Biden laptop and the locking out of the New York Post in a minute, but David, you were there primarily to report on COVID, right? First, I want to know, what was the biggest takeaway from the reporting that you did while you were at Twitter?
I would say there are a few takeaways, kind of each equally important, and they all intersect with each other, which is that, number one, we know that the government had an extreme amount of influence on Twitter. They made their wishes very clear to the executives at the company repeatedly about who they wanted to be deplatformed and the type of information that they wanted to be either removed entirely or flagged in some way. So we know that there was direct pressure from the White House on Twitter to behave and, have the platform work in a certain way, number one. Number two, we know that Twitter then had a variety of systems in place, from sort of algorithmic systems to human beings working to take down certain types of information, either labeling things as misinformation or actually suspending certain accounts. So you had these things sort of working in tandem. You have the government, you have kind of computer algorithms working, and you have people who are actually making decisions about this content online. And what I tried to cover with my reporting on it was the interplay between these three things.
One question that someone's asking Rob Mayer in the Q&A is, he says this: my wife is highly educated, subscribes to the New York Times, The Atlantic, listens to NPR, reads our local newspaper, which is the Star Tribune daily. When I told her I was going to a webinar tonight, she asked, what about? And I said, the Twitter files. And with a blank stare, she asked, what's that? This story, he says, should be known by tens of millions, maybe not on par with Watergate, but not far behind. What can we do to get this story known by tens of millions, and why don't tens of millions know about it now? Nell, I feel like you want to jump in on that.
It's deeply inconvenient. That's why, because the story is extraordinarily inconvenient for this sort of group that wants to tightly control a certain narrative. And so Twitter employees.
What is that narrative about?
That narrative was that the Hunter Biden story was a nothing burger or didn't exist. And so, and that there's no potentially tricky things or complex things there at all. And that suppressing the New York Post was just unequivocally the only good thing to do, and there should be no discussion. And so that's basically how the mainstream media approached the situation. And one important thing I think to know about the dynamic is that New York Times reporters and Twitter employees are socially very much the same group. They're friends. This is one project. These aren't separate, like the media that's covering the Twitter files and the Twitter employees who were doing the actions of suppressing whatever they didn't like that week. That's all one sort of clique of people behaving. And so, yeah, that's why the story's been a nothing burger in the mainstream press, because it's inconvenient, it's embarrassing.
I think one of the things that's, maybe I should follow my own advice to stop being shocked about things, but it's a very strange universe we're living in, where we're exposing a story of basically unchecked private corporate power and the way that corporate power is working in tandem with the federal government. Now, you would think, like, by the old rules, that a liberal press, let's say, would be extraordinarily interested in that story. And yet somehow that progressive press is relying on a libertarian argument, which is, it's a private company, it's none of our business. Like, how did we get to that point where those are the terms, and somehow caring about the way that, a private company is influencing the public discussion is something that has become sort of like the purview of the political right?
Yeah, I was going to say, first of all, I think you should continue to remain shocked and outraged. The minute that you're not, something's broken in us. And you should be shocked and outraged, because I think this is the key. This is one of the keys that we haven't mentioned yet. Twitter and Facebook are not like the New York Times or the Free Press or Public or NPR. These are platforms. They exist because Congress has carved out a special provision for them called Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act. They only exist because we have provided very powerful liability protections for those platforms from being sued for copyright violations, slander, anything else, that people can freely share content onto those platforms, and those platforms are not responsible. Now, they may need to take it down, and they do take it down, and we can talk about those content moderation decisions, but they have a different legal status than a content providing media organization. Now, we can talk about whether that's possible to maintain, but the idea, the intent of Congress was, there's never any question about it. There's never been any question about it in the court cases that have litigated it. These are supposed to be places where you can post your information and not have it taken down. Now, obviously, there's some limits to that, but it is not the same constraints. The expectation is that you are going to provide a much more open access, like the internet itself, like the railroad lines, like the electrical wires, like the water systems. Like, a private company cannot deprive you electricity or water because they don't like your politics. And yet we're headed where the goal has been to deprive people this free speech platform because they don't like their politics. And that's extremely troubling, because you can sit there and go, well, you still have freedom of speech. You can't be on Facebook, you can't be on Twitter. You can't write for any of these big media companies, but you can go down to the town square and put up posters? I mean, it's absurd.
Right.
The only way to communicate is on these platforms.
Right. The argument being that like the town square has been digitized, and yet none of our sort of constitutional rights, including the First Amendment, have translated online. And the question is, should there be a kind of First Amendment on a place like Twitter?
Should they be regulated like a common carrier?
Exactly. Let's talk for a minute, if we could, about like the real world impact of what happened on Twitter and what actually happened in the real world. And I would argue that they have a huge impact on each other in COVID, right? So like the whole argument that's made by a lot of people is, who cares what happens on Twitter? It's not real life, right? And yet Twitter became, I would say, during COVID and other social media platforms, a really essential alternative communication information mechanism where people could look for alternative viewpoints that certainly weren't getting a megaphone in mainstream media organizations. But as our reporting showed, some of those people who were sort of dissenting from, let's just say, mass lockdown policies, like Dr. Jay Bhattacharya at Stanford, who we had on the last FP forum, he was suppressed by Twitter. And David, I guess I'm wondering, and I know there's no way to measure this perfectly, but how big of a role do you think Twitter, or the suppression that happened on Twitter, played in the suppression sort of more broadly in the culture? In other words, people who expressed a view 2 years ago that school lockdowns were maybe not the best thing were called horrible names like grandma killers, right? And now, in hindsight, and thanks to the reporting of, Alec McGillis at ProPublica and others, I think that the people that were promoting the Great Barrington Declaration, like Jay Bhattacharya, have been more than vindicated. So, is Twitter real life or not real life? And to what extent do you think that the way it put its thumb on the scale on the COVID debates actually impacted the real world consequences that people, especially kids, experienced over the past few years?
Okay, big question. Yeah, there's a lot there.
Pick anything you want.
Okay, so just my sort of like top level reactions to that, because I could talk about this for the next 3 hours to answer that question, but I would say, no one can quantify it, but what I've observed in all of my reporting over the last number of years is that there is a certain clique of public health professionals, some of whom are within the government, many of whom are at, elite institutions, and others are these people who sort of self-appointed pundits who somehow managed to get these really large followings on Twitter. And what I observed was those same people were interviewed over and over and over again in the Times and a handful of other places. They were, in CNN, and it's this same sort of clique of, not much more than a dozen people, maybe 24 tops, but and they all were on the same message. And then you had people like Jay Bhattacharya, Martin Kulldorff, when I met with them at the Great Barrington Declaration, I didn't even know that was going to be a declaration. I thought I was just there to interview them. And after it came out, it then was very clear that these were sort of teams and that they were branded in a certain way. And so was I. As I was there as a journalist to interview these people, all of a sudden I was Coke money or something. It was really bizarre, which still is being said today about me.
Coke like the billionaires, not like the drink.
Correct. Yeah. Coke, the dark money, right wing.
I was thinking more like the drug.
I guess
I was like, David's Coke money here.
I wish, yeah. So this is with the case. So the reason I mention all of the public health people who were just over and over interviewed at the same, kind of very high level media outlets on TV and in print, et cetera, was that draws a really strong bright line between them and people like Bhattacharya and Kulldorff and others. So, and the reason, and there's a lot of, circumstantial evidence behind this, the reason why a lot of these people were on TV so frequently, were interviewed so frequently in the Times, was that they became Twitter celebrities, a lot of these public health people. So when these people are given a really big platform on Twitter, as you all were saying, arguably the most important social media platform as far as media goes. This is where all the journalists hang out. That's where they're finding their people. Journalists, a lot of them, they're lazy. This is where I'm going to find someone. I'm not going to start digging around looking at, the rosters of various universities. I'm just going to see who has a big following. So when you have those people who are amplified in a certain way, and it becomes this feedback loop between Twitter, and then the more they're in the New York Times, the bigger their Twitter following, the bigger the following, the more that the journalists want to keep going back to them. And then here's the thing though, what I reported and what we found and what you guys saw with Jay with the do not amplify label and these things that happened to Martin Kulldorff and others was they were pushed down. So you had these two things happening at the same time, this like crazy feedback loop with this one group and a suppression of the other. And we know that Twitter is incredibly influential with journalists. So it shouldn't be viewed just in this narrow lens of, oh, what's happening on Twitter? It should be viewed through the lens of how Twitter influences the influencers.
And the do not amplify label, for listeners,
yeah.
Can you explain what that was actually?
That was in your reporting, Bari, I think, but I could explain it because I saw it.
I can explain also.
Yeah, okay. Tossing me a softball.
No. Just for people who are listening. Basically,
right.
So anyone who wasn't doctrinaire in being pro super hardcore lockdowns, pro whatever was the latest, it was no masking, and then it was masking, and then it was it would get a label basically of do not amplify, which meant that their tweets wouldn't start to trend. They would often get search bans also, which meant that you couldn't find them if you searched for a person in Twitter search bar, like little funny ways that Twitter has to suppress people who are unsavory.
Just to clarify, we saw that label on Jay. I did not see that label on a number of other people who were listed as contrarians. However, what I did try to show in the reporting was that although they didn't have that particular label, much of their content that they were tweeting was flagged. And flagged can mean either had a label on it that said, this is misleading, warning, or, and then once you have that type of label, that I believe then triggers certain things happening within the algorithm. And it certainly shows viewers on, or participants in Twitter, when you see a label like that, it obviously is characterizing the content, or they were suspended entirely and just taken off the platform. And I gave examples of that.
Twitter
as well.
Still adds a fact check and a misleading label to tweets that say that taxpayers, I don't know if they're still actively doing this, but the labels still remain on the tweets that I've seen. Tweets that say that taxpayers paid for the vaccine to be developed. It's the strangest thing.
Wow. But they did contribute.
No, but
the
there's
NIH funds all sorts of research.
You're someone that worked on the tech business desk at the New York Times. I think David just really well summarized the dynamic of sort of choosing heroes and choosing villains that happen. I wondered if you just wanted to add any color to that. If not, I'll go to Michael.
Oh, if inside gossip about it happens?
Yeah, just inside gossip. Exactly.
It's just like middle school. There's nothing super sophisticated or planned. It's not like at the beginning of the year, people sit down and say, here are our villains this year. But there's just a narrative and you stick to the narrative.
One of the things that's interesting is you can literally see it happening right now around Ozempic, which is this weight loss drug. Well, it's really interesting, right? There was a 60-minute segment. I'm fascinated by this subject. I talked about it a bit on Real Time with Bill Maher on Friday night because this drug is everywhere and it's being used. It's miraculous for people that are really overweight, but it's also being used, in all over LA for people that want to go from a size 2 to a size 0. But the interesting thing about the way the public conversation is playing out is you have a few doctors who are being paid by Novo, one of the drug companies behind this. And they're on 60 Minutes and they're in the New York Times and they're trending on Twitter. And it's like this, you are literally watching in real time the way that the amplification system, David, that you just explained, the way that it actually works. Before we move on a little bit to some subscriber questions, Michael, there's so much that has come out about at the FBI, Hunter Biden, the pre-bunking of the laptop. I think that even those who are following this pretty closely might find some of the ins and outs a little bit hard to follow. Can you sort of top line the story for us? Like, what happened with the Hunter Biden laptop for people that haven't been paying attention to it, you know, other than the tragedies, frankly, the tragic nature of a lot of the images on it? You mentioned before a phrase called pre-bunking. Can you explain to us what you mean by that and what that story really, really revealed?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, so Hunter Biden, as many people know, was basically, and there's not really, this will sound pejorative, but it's not meant that way. And it's not a marginal view. I mean, Hunter Biden was trading his father's name, including access to his father, to business people in China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Ukraine, and other business ventures. Tens of millions of dollars came into the Biden family through Hunter Biden. At the same time, Hunter was slipping into a serious alcohol and cocaine addiction, as is often occurs with people in late stage addiction. They just they're intoxicated a lot of the time. And he had 2 laptops that got water damaged in some way. He dropped them off at a repair store in Delaware. He never came back for them. According to the terms of his agreement, they then were forfeited to the computer store. Long story short, these laptops were given to FBI, or I'm sorry, the laptop was given to the FBI in December 2019. Then the laptop owner was waiting for there to be an investigation. Nothing happened from FBI, despite the fact that we know that there was significant evidence of illegal activity on the laptop, and not just the prostitution, potential human trafficking, drug use, but also failing to register, for example, as a foreign agent is a crime. He didn't do that, and there's lots of evidence for it. Fast forward to 2020, and you start to get FBI agents going to Twitter and Facebook and saying, you should watch out because there could be a Russian disinformation campaign consisting of a hack and leak operation, meaning hacked materials being leaked to the media, involving Hunter Biden. And this was occurring really in the late summer and early fall. We also have an extremely strange workshop that Aspen Institute hosts with the head of trust and safety from Facebook and Twitter and the top national security correspondents from the New York Times and Washington Post, role-playing how to not cover and debunk a potential Russian hack and leak operation as it relates to Hunter Biden. Now, all of this could, again, be absolutely curious coincidence. Certainly, Hunter Biden was in the news. He was a subject of a congressional investigation. But what you see is basically, if the FBI had the laptop, we also know they were spying on Rudy Giuliani, who gave the laptop to the New York Post and got it from this computer repairman. So you have one of 2 scenarios. Either the FBI people who were warning of a Russian disinformation campaign relating to Hunter Biden did not know that the FBI also had the laptop. That's called compartmentalization. Or if they did, then they were pre-bunking effectively information that they knew existed and that they knew would come out right before the elections. We don't know exactly, but we know congressional investigators are super interested in this and they're looking into it because, minimally, you have a situation of a highly stovepiped FBI, which is what we all got worried about after 9/11 occurred, that our intelligence agencies weren't sharing information within the agency. Or you had a situation where the FBI, people within the FBI, and then also retired and former FBI officials who were at Twitter, including the former deputy chief of staff and the former chief legal counsel. The chief legal counsel became the deputy Twitter legal counsel, who were then in Twitter, and we know that former legal counsel to FBI was advocating that the Hunter Biden laptop be censored by Twitter. If, minimally, you have an exaggeration of Russian interference by FBI, which is bad, because if you're exaggerating some threats, then you're underestimating other threats. You have over compartmentalization, or you have the FBI participating in an influence operation aimed at influencing the 2020 election. If it's the latter, if it's the maximal conspiracy potential, it's just a gigantic, bigger than Watergate type story because it involved the FBI. If it's the more innocent version, we should also know that to clear FBI's name and also understand, what do you do in a situation where you've got one group of people that know perfectly well that Hunter Biden's laptop is going to Rudy Giuliani and then post, and you're warning the social media companies that they should be aware of this. I will say I raised the possibility, the innocent explanation possibility with our mutual friend, Martin Gurry, who was a top CIA analyst. And he just thought it was absurd that it was anything other than the more darker version of history. So we just need to get to the bottom of it. We may not be able to, but there's certainly a lot more questions and people that should be interviewed and investigated.
Like there's going to be congressional hearings about this.
There definitely is. And Congressman Dan Bishop spoke about the Twitter files and Hunter Biden's laptop on the floor of the Congress yesterday. They, as you may know, that there was a significant amount of delay in getting a Speaker of the House. So they just set up the final committee structures, but they haven't named, they have, I believe it's tomorrow that Yoel Roth, Vijaya Gadde, and Jim Baker are all testifying in front of Congress. I'm not privy to what those questions will be, but I think that's a pretty significant event.
Well, I'll look forward to you being called by Congress. Okay, I want to move on a little bit to like process question. A lot of people want to understand what it was like on the ground and what actually we had access to, right? The kind of information we had access to. We had a source in Elon Musk who, unlike a lot of sources, right? Every source has an agenda when they go and leak a bunch of documents. Rarely do you have a source that's the wealthiest, most powerful man in the world announcing to the world his agenda publicly. Yeah. No.
Well, also, I don't think there's ever been a situation where someone buys a company, a big company, not a cheap little company, a big, expensive company, and then decides to invite reporters in and open up the archives of that company, open up the emails, open up the Slacks, open up the internal history of the company to sort of like, I don't, he's had, I'm sure, a lot of goals, but among them was a little bit to chastise the previous regime, chastise the previous owners, to embarrass them a little. And that was just like beyond the findings inside of Twitter's Slack and emails. There was just the fact of it that was so fascinating and so surreal and kind of amazing was being in the office with the owner of a company who was like, just let her rip. Just right. Get in there.
It's not company, and it's not just any owner. I mean, one question we're just getting a lot about is, did we meet Elon Musk? What was our impression of him? How would you describe him? Now I'll let you take that first crack at that one.
Okay, well, we walk in and it's like late at night. Mom's picked us up from the airport. My mom, I'm from San Francisco. She takes the baby home. She drops us off at Twitter headquarters. It's like 11:30 p.m. Elon Musk is just standing there at a cafe top table with like 2-3 other engineers, and they're just working. And he is, he's charming, a little frenetic, a little like hard to pin down. And he's a little bit like a kid in a candy store in the Twitter office. So kind of running around, opening cabinets, showing off all the eccentric and absurd things that the previous Twitter management had done, all the wacky t-shirts, all the this, all that, in a way of sort of like saying, I can't believe I own this place now. Like, I can't believe this is my company. And so we're kind of like trying to get the lay of the land. He wants to show off all the wacky stuff.
And bear in mind, it's like 1 a.m. on a Friday night.
It was just surreal, just very strange. And then the next day, then we start actually getting into the documents, which involves a kind of chaotic process of Musk saying, allow these reporters to have access to internal emails and Slack unfettered. And then all of the people kind of who are between those words and the actual act of getting access into internal emails and Slack unfettered, kind of trying to gum it up a little bit. And so there's a little while of sort of dealing with that and navigating that. And that's where the Jim Baker and all that comes in.
Yeah. I mean, I think one thing, and Michael, jump in here if I'm characterizing this correctly. We had in Elon Musk a source that was on Twitter saying, they've got it all. They've got unfettered access to everything. The only condition is that they publish the stories first on Twitter. And I'll say, number one, that was the only condition. There was absolutely no editorial input by Elon. The thing, though, that is slightly more complicated is this notion of unfettered access. I think when people hear that, they imagine that, these journalists walk into a warehouse. It's highly organized. It's out.
There's stacks of paper organized with
stack.
crimes.
Exactly. And in fact, what it was working with 2 laptops among up to 8 or 10 people, using these pretty laborious e-discovery tools that, were fairly slow. We came to learn how to use them better. But Michael, is that a fair characterization of how it worked? Because I think one of the accusations is that we kind of cherry picked, or to be less generous, that we nut picked and chose only the stories that sort of comported with our political bias. And Michael, I wondered if you would just address that criticism.
Yeah, I mean, it's just what you said. I mean, we would sort of say, can you give us all the emails of this person that cover these subject areas over these dates? And then we would get a big chunk of files, like 2,000 emails or 3,000 emails or 900 emails. I can't prove it, but I do not believe that they were able to go through those emails, because it was taking us a long time to go through them, and they would get them and they would give it to us. And then also we saw no evidence of anything being taken out of the Slack messages or the emails. In other words, if they were messing with it, you would expect to have somebody say something, or there's to be some reference, and for something to not add up. And that was not what was going on. We also interacted with legal staff, and they flew out a paralegal from the Midwest, and she sat there in the office and went through it and gave it to us. And we also interacted with one of Elon's attorneys, and I just never had a sense from either of them that they were spending any time looking for content or trying to change things. I just compare it more to a smash and grab operation. We'd sort of be in there a little bit competing, and you'd be like, and they'd be like, well, like, David would be like, I want to get the COVID stuff. And I was kind of like, well, can we do the Hunter Biden laptop stuff before that? It was probably more just trying to get all this information into to try to get it out. They would sometimes be like, I'd be like, can I have all the emails from such and such a person? And they would be like literally, like, there's just got to specify a little bit more than that, because there's too many of them. So
and
yeah,
during this, then Elon would be kind of wandering in and out of scene, kind of coming in, grabbing a slice of pizza, and wandering off camera. Like
But I think people don't realize, at least when I was there, Michael touched on this. This was actually much harder to do than I think, just seeing random comments on Twitter, or people saying, why didn't you do this? Or, go get, as everyone's been describing, it's just important to really emphasize the tools we were given this is not like stuff that regular people are used to using. That's like a really good user interface. These are like super tedious, weird kind of backdoor ways. And one of the people, in addition to the attorneys and all the other people, there was an engineer assigned to help us, at least when I was there with Michael. And funny what Michael said, we were all sort of like gently kind of like horse race with each other. No, you get to go first. No, I get the engineer. It's almost like a tug of war, who got to get the engineer first. But I mean, unless this was like a brilliant scheme, I mean, I literally was watching this person like typing in commands to try to look stuff up for us. So the notion that there was something untoward happening, it doesn't seem credible, because I mean, I was literally watching them doing the searches in front of our eyes there in the room.
Well, I think there's an idea that it was much more planned and thought through than it was, which is that we showed up at Twitter without a list of, it was like we showed up just a few hours after being pinged to come and get these documents, but it was like, okay, well, what do we want to know? Like, I guess I'm curious about these 5 stories and this. So it's like on the fly thinking. And then also, as anyone who's worked with a source knows, a source gets spooked and leaves. So it was also like, okay, well, maybe we have these documents and this access for 12 hours. Maybe we have it for 2 days. Maybe we have it for 4 days. Yeah. I don't know. Like, you have no idea. And so, because your source can decide on a whim he's done, which happens all the time in reporting a story, and usually not quite so publicly.
Well,
Michael, remember our last day when they were like, get out? They're like, everyone what was that? It was, like by 5 o'clock.
Well, it was more like, it
the
was
tone
kind of like,
changed.
yeah. I mean, and to be fair, I think it was clear from the Twitter files that we were kind of coming to the end, and they just were, I mean, and Elon says this, he was very honest about their business problems, and he has been, that they're having a lot of problems. I mean, just yesterday, I think you guys may have seen, it's gone viral on Twitter that people have been locking their accounts and getting more views on certain tweets than when they're unlocked. I mean, so Elon is openly admitting that he doesn't even know all the different algorithms and systems that are up and running. One funny moment, he actually, because I think it's important to remember, he's a coder and he knows programming and computers. Like we think of him as rockets and cars, but he originally starts with PayPal, of course. But he once showed us a really funny video of a kind of sketch comedy between programmers that I thought was absolutely hilarious. We should try to find it and post it. But it kind of was about basically the problems of taking highly technical engineers and having it translate into products that really work for the public. So they're struggling, and meanwhile, we were there, and it's like, I think around that time, Elon said that they were going to stop paying rent to their San Francisco landlord. They were just having,
in the bedrooms. They had these. I made one of the engineers show me the bedrooms because I was obsessed with this idea that San Francisco, this city that they can't enforce a single law ever, basically, when it has been trying to crack down on what it discovered were 2 to 4 or something like that bedrooms in Twitter headquarters. And indeed, Twitter had converted a few conference rooms into bedrooms. And that was really fun to see. They just had like papered over the windows. And I mean, it showed the change in culture for sure.
He was trying to create a startup culture to reboot the company. And so, the Times, they're only, by the way, we were reporting all the Twitter files. They did a huge front page piece about that Elon was staffing up his legal team to deal with lawsuits. So like the legal team was kind of, I think it was a little bit like, they were like, look, we're trying to help, but I mean, we were, like we're trying to run a company here. So there was a point at which, but then Matt went back, and I think Lee went and did some more work. So, there's still things, it sort of continued to dribble out. I went back a second time when Matt was there and got a little bit more information and ended up helping Matt a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to keep in mind that there is a lot more there. And the punchline for me has been, there needs to be transparency. Elon said repeatedly that he was going to make all of it public. Is that happening? I don't know. At a certain point, we don't control Elon. Obviously, it's worth reminding everybody that that's why I say it's sort of a smash and grab. It's kind of
say something, Michael. Though, can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah.
What's that?
What does it mean when people are like making quote it public? Because there is no it. What is that? They're going to release the email accounts of 100 employees, because that's one of the things that I don't know what your thought is about that, but people keep talking, making it public. What is the it? When we were there, it was like really hard to do a lot of these searches, and there was like these, whether it's email or Slack or so what is that? How can it all be made public?
Well, I think the impulse behind that, and I really agree with this impulse, is like there's a lot of shady stuff happening on these platforms in the background that is of deep public interest, and we revealed like the tiniest sliver of that, and people are desperate for greater transparency. What I don't think they understand, and David, I really agree with you, is when people are saying just make it all transparent, it's like, do you guys understand like how hard it was to redact every single name that wasn't a C-suite level person at the company? Imagine yourself as a junior employee of Twitter. Would you actually want all of those emails to be public if you put yourself in that person's position? And like, there's a reason that we had to kind of tweeze out the information that we did and make the judgments that we make as journalists as to what is in the public interest and what isn't.
That's the tricky part. It's who gets named, like who's thrust into the public eye, whose embarrassing emails are printed publicly. And when you're a reporter, you're always balancing that and figuring out what is in the public interest, like you said, and what's just mean. Exactly. And so I think that although I don't know, part of me does think he should just make it a searchable database and just say
I
to
don't
hell
think
with it.
so.
I don't
I
know. I don't know.
I think that the other thing that I really want to emphasize is that, it's not as if we snapped our fingers and said, I want to do a search for all mentions of the name Michael Schellenberger in Slack, in email, private, public, etc. And you had it a second later. No, if you went to this sort of e-discovery tool again with the help of the paralegal or the lawyers, that single search for Michael Schellenberger's name within the dates of January 5th to January 10th of 2020 might take a day. So I think that it's really important to emphasize that we didn't just have a giant data set to release, and we also wanted to do to use the tools that we use as journalists to decide what was in the public interest, what wasn't in the public interest. There are many, many stories: the elections in Brazil, the elections in India, questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, many more things about COVID, about myocarditis, that we just didn't have, the chance to get to. As Nellie mentioned before, sources are fickle. Whether that source is, a mom blowing the whistle on her school board or a very, very powerful man like Elon Musk. And we have several questions about the combative exchange between me and Elon on Twitter. Here's one question. Has Elon soured on the free press? Well, he did unfollow us. Considering the characterization of Musk wasn't all positive, Joseph Wolfson asks, Bari, you had publicly sparred with Elon Musk after you criticized the decision to suspend journalists that he accused of violating his, quote, doxing policy over his private jet tracker. Are the two of you on good terms? Have you spoken about it off Twitter? Well, we had many, 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 many signal exchanges over the course of those weeks. Everyone saw everything play out in public. People saw his response to me. They saw that he unfollowed me. They saw that he unfollowed the free press. What I'll say is that life is long, and I regard Elon Musk as one of the most interesting people in the world right now. And the story of what he'll do at the helm of Twitter is one that I'm extraordinarily fascinated in, to say nothing of his role at SpaceX and Tesla. And I knew that in saying something publicly, that I might piss him off, and that he very well could take away access from our sort of portion of that smelly conference room that I mentioned before. And that is what happened. And, you make calls, and I felt that it was really important not to pull that punch. Nell, I don't know if you want to add anything to that.
No, I mean, you don't want to be in anyone's pocket. And if Elon is going to govern Twitter in a way that is focused on free speech and focused on righting some of these wrongs and fulfilling the rhetoric that he says, that I really agree with in a lot of ways, that I want to see him live up to it. And I think we deserve that. We deserve a platform that is open and honest, and that allows critics, and that allows even the jerkiest of jerks, who are some of the people he banned that night, to be on the platform. And if he's going to decide that something like his jet tracker is suddenly verboten, that should be done in a thoughtful way. I feel really good about it. I think it is what it is. He had to be criticized for that. And
I'll say, just even from a strategic perspective, the people that he was kicking off Twitter that night, which he later reversed, and that was a great thing, he was martyring a bunch of assholes. And, these are people
the worst part of it all.
These are people who are, major bullies.
They're so mean to me. Why do you have to make them look cool?
They're major bullies of mine, but it's like, so what? A principle is a principle,
I know.
And
I think it was great. I retweeted you. And I think it was important, and he did back down. And, one of the things, and like I said, I've criticized Elon in the past. He just tweeted the other day that wind and solar are going to power the world. And I was just like, dude, no.
Michael starts shaking.
I'm just like, oh, man. But, it's like, I think it's all kind of a boundaries issue. I think people were kind of like, well, he invited you in, then you reported on the files. And so what, now you're buds? That wasn't how any of us thought of it. Like, we weren't like, oh, we're now like we were pretty clear, like, we're going in and we're going to try to get the information out because we're greedy journalists. Like, we're trying to be journalists here. And then when he does something we don't like, criticize that. And I think the one thing I'll say that did surprise me about him, because you're obviously dealing with this extremely powerful person. I mean, Walter, we learned when we were there, Walter Isaacson is like working on a book about him. It's going to come out soon. But one story was, he came in at one point, and I had the attitude that Nelly had, which was like, I don't know how many times I'm going to have a chance to just ask Elon Musk any question I want. And so we were like, hey, can we, because we were just chit-chatting, we're like, hey, do you mind if we just go ahead and record this? And he was like, no, go ahead. So we were recording it. And I was just like, wow. So I asked him, I was like, do you regret having suggested that Nancy Pelosi's husband was assaulted by somebody that he was in a gay relationship with? And he goes, I do regret that. And we have it on. We haven't even written about this yet. Hope I'm not spoiling your story.
Not at all.
But I was like, I thought that was big of him. And then on Twitter the other day, he confirmed that he actually had called Nancy Pelosi apparently and apologized to her for this. He also said, do you have another one?
I think one of the things that's so unusual, and certainly as a journalist and really just as an American, like amazing to be around, is that unlike a lot of other very wealthy, powerful people, there's no insulation. There's no like public self and private self. What you need is what you're seeing on Twitter. And like that prosecute Fauci joke was something he had said to us several times before he ended up tweeting it out. And like, I think it's a very, very unusual that someone of his stature, and frankly, anyone living in like the digital era, has so little gap between what they say in public and what they say in private. Okay, here's a good question for everyone. And maybe David, let's start with you. Kirk asks this: what has the Twitter files done for each of you regarding your politics? And several people asked this question. Did telling this story change your mind at all? Shift your politics on COVID or anything? There's just several questions about the extent to which this story had an impact on any of our politics. I'm happy for anyone to take that question.
I would say it's a really good question. For me, it just reinforced sort of what I observed, over these last few years, at least in relation to how the government and how the media covered COVID and the science around it. That this just sort of reinforced these things that were out in the open that we observed, or that I observed already. So it didn't change my view. It just made me slightly more jaundiced. That would kind of be my top level.
I think, I went in very much thinking this is a group of partisans who are trying to censor the American discourse. And I think the thing that actually changed was I was surprised to see, like, Yoel Roth got a lot of shit and deserves a lot of shit for a lot of the stuff that he oversaw. He also, in a lot of emails, is pushing back and saying, no, I won't censor that. And in a lot of emails, the government is writing him, various law enforcement. He is getting incoming asking him to censor enormous numbers of things. And he's saying no. And I don't know, maybe I was like so cynical that I thought he'd be like, yes, more censorship to everything. But he was really drawing lines and trying to hold it back. And I was impressed by that. And I think there were people inside Twitter who were trying really hard to make it what America deserves.
Yeah, I second that.
Yeah, I'll just add one thing to that, which is, no one wants a platform like Twitter or Facebook or any others that have no moderation at all. They would be just gutters, of porn and just like disgusting things. And I think one of the things that just like humbled me in watching all of this was A, just how unbelievably powerful these tools are, and B, the difficulty of making those moderation decisions, because you need moderation, right? And now we're watching that play out with Twitter's new leadership. I think everyone saw the story about this BBC documentary about India's prime minister, about Modi, that is banned from Twitter. Did someone make that decision?
Banned in India, like banned for Indian users.
Exactly. But like, was that someone in the Philippines making that decision? Was that a decision made by people in this sort of like star chamber that we had discovered? Again, like it's now maybe the biases and the bugbears will be different, but the same problems are going to still be there for the people currently running Twitter. And there's just like no silver bullet, I think, to the question of moderation. Shelley,
I think there's a little bit of a silver bullet.
What is it?
What's the silver bullet?
Transparency. I mean, I don't think it's a silver bullet, but I think it gets my own views. I felt the need to go and get more clarity about my views of social media regulation. And there's people who disagree strongly in their politics on the right and left, if that's even the right way to categorize it, that all agree transparency on content moderation is the key. It does not infringe upon the proprietary technologies of these companies. It absolutely is necessary. It may be that there's other things necessary after that transparency into content moderation decisions, but we don't know yet. So the first thing the Congress must do, in my view, and let it sit for a couple of years, require transparency on content moderation. I feel extremely strongly about it. I feel like left and right can agree on it. It should be something we need to do because, again, Elon Musk deserves a lot of credit for this. But the issue of whether or not you're going to make your content moderation transparent or not should not be up to the owners of these platforms. They have Section 230 given to them by the American people in the same way that we gave people the right to have electrical grids and railroads. They have obligations that come with that incredible privilege, I believe.
I love this line of argument, and I'm in for it. Clarence Thomas is the one who was like who was arguing for common carrier. For these companies to be regulated like common carriers.
He mentioned it in a dissent, I think in the last term of the court, and it was really interesting. I can share it with subscribers later. Here's a question for everyone. What's Elon Musk's motive in all of this? That's a question from Richard.
I have to go. Did I promise until 6?
Yeah, you did, but you have one more minute.
I have to go. We're working on a big human trafficking story, so we got to go. We got to go hit the.
Get out of here, Shelley. It's too much of your pretty face anyway.
Bye, Shelley.
You guys, you're the best. Bye, everybody.
We'll wrap up. Bye. Okay,
right.
David.
Yeah.
What's Musk's motivation in your view?
I mean, it seems like as I think you described it before, he seems to be someone who genuinely has sort of heterodox views on things. This guy has an electric car company. Years ago, he was the darling of the left, but then he didn't go along with certain things that the far left hold dear. So then he became the enemy. And I think it's hard to know. But I will say one sort of maybe dovetail to this that I think is interesting. Musk and Twitter have gotten so much shit, from the Twitter files and otherwise, but to me, the elephant in the room is Facebook and some of these other things that like the only reason that this whole thing happened was because the richest guy in the world bought this company. But from looking at the discovery documents from multiple lawsuits, stuff at Facebook seemed far worse than whatever we discovered at Twitter. So to me, it's an irony that Twitter has all this attention on it for the various errors and bad doings from content moderation, but it's only because we got lucky that Elon Musk bought it. I guess Zuckerberg's not selling, but who knows what's going on at Facebook? It's a black box. But from what we've seen in the discovery in some of these lawsuits, it doesn't look good.
Nell, what's Elon's motivation?
I think his motivations are a little different than he's operating on a different mental plane. It's not like, I think his motivations are a little bit fun and curiosity. And he's already done this industry and that industry. And why not try to do conversation, like the sort of global conversation? Like that sounds like a fun, strange project. I don't know. I don't think he's he tried to get out of the deal before it closed. This isn't someone who's sitting down and coming up with a 10-year life plan and here are my goals and here are the steps to achieve that goal. This is someone who's maybe that company's for sale, or that company pissed me off because they blocked my favorite comedy thing. Let me try to buy it. Like, this is someone who's acting on the fly. And I think he's acting from sort of gut instincts and humor and amusement, whatever amuses his mind. And I think that's how he sort of moves through the world in general.
I think one of the things that struck me about him was, it's easy to see all of this as revenge, right? The decision to like put out the Twitter files, embarrass the previous regime. But I really, really think that a lot of his motivation was sincere, and that he really, really believes in the importance of Twitter, perhaps because, like me, he is addicted to it and is convinced that it is the only place to have a public conversation.
Well,
But
what bigger fun challenge to take on than to take on fixing global conversation?
right.
Like, that's the coolest thing. If you were just picking a problem to try to tackle. I don't know.
Last question, a log rolling question for each of you. What's the next story that you're working on, and where can we find your work, David Zweig?
Well, a teaser for my next piece in the Free Press on gain of function, which some of the viewers may be familiar with, listeners. So that's what's coming next. Get ready.
How you're running the Wuhan lab of virology. No,
That is correct. After the Koch brothers paid me off, I then bought the Wuhan lab, and I'm doing some gain of function research on my own there.
And where can people check out your book, David? When's it coming out?
God only knows. It's because I'm busy doing this stuff. It's going to be a while, but you can find me on Twitter, of course, and Substack and everywhere else, and stay connected with me.
Amazing. And Nellie Bowles, what's the lead item in TGIF this week? Little curtain raiser.
Oh, yeah. I don't know yet. Hold on. Wait, I just had it though. What is the lead item? I think it was going to be something about the battle, Trump and the vaccine, and how the Republicans are all trying to like downplay that they ever liked the vaccine. Something like that is really funny
like
to me.
how the vaccine's a political liability. For
Yeah,
Trump.
that like Operation Warp Speed, which was actually the best thing he did, is a huge political liability for him, and that is just so funny to me. But yeah, my next story is TGIF tomorrow morning, and as for my book, David, I am in the same boat. It's so late.
It's a nightmare. It's a nightmare.
It's a nightmare. It's so much harder to do than to do a TGIF.
So instead, all she does is TGIF. Anyway, I want to thank my guests, Nellie Bowles, who is also my wife, the wonderful David Zweig, and the ghost of Michael Schellenberger. And thanks to the more than 500 of you who joined tonight. We're so happy to have you. We're so happy to have your excellent questions. See you again here 2 weeks from now. So Wednesday, February 15th for our next FP Forum. Look out for an announcement. It's going to be a fabulous one. I bid you adieu and good night.